Hey, I'm Brian, and this is Vinyl.paints. And in this video, we're going to compare and review different cell vinyl paints. It's been a few years since I did a look into the different cell vinyl paints, and that's mainly because nothing has really changed. I couldn't get my hands on that mystery brand out of Japan, and I had enough inventory of Chromacolour and Toon Tones that it didn't really make sense to try something different. We are now in 2026, and the cell painting world has changed. This video is a bit of a wild ride. I really hope you watch it all. But here are some timestamps for a quick navigation or for future reference. Anytime I do a large video like this, it takes a long time and I lose algorithm momentum. Because I disappear for longer than normal on these bigger videos, any likes, comments, and shares would be much appreciated. So let's start with the bad. Unfortunately, although you might find some lingering supplies, I've heard from 2 different suppliers that Toon Tones is no longer making paint. As a cell painter, this is devastating news, especially since Toon Tones was the first paint I ever used. This leaves Chromacolor as the last true cell paint, and this really is disappointing to have less options, and it does make me nervous for the future of cell painting. The only other option was a Japanese company named Loppo Gazai art supply. I stumbled across Lobo on Instagram and I was immediately interested from the pictures. I saw that they had the largest selection of any manufacturer. They had cells in different thicknesses and amounts. It was amazing. It was perfect. It was everything I could want for in a shop. But unfortunately, all I could do was window shop because I've never been able to get anything out of that shop. There is one other possible brand, Lefranc Flashe, which is a vinyl emulsion paint. I've had a lot of people have mixed results with it, but it is a cell paint substitution, not an actual cell paint. So this is the world of cell painting in 2026, as displayed on a risk board. On the West Coast, you have Toon Tones, the first paint I ever used. Out of the UK, we have Chromacolour. And in France, we have Lefranc Flashe. And in Japan, we have Loppo Gazai art supply. I think this story will be much more interesting with visual aids, so let's use some Lego figures to tell the story. This is my computer, and this is me, and we're somewhere around here. Way back in 2024, I actually sent a DM to Lobo Gazai, and I never heard back. I blame it on the fact that I had a typo in the message, but also, if I'm being honest, I'm guilty of not checking my Instagram messages too, so I didn't take it personally. I tried to make an order and it was unable to process, so at this point, I figured I might need some professional help. And this is my cousin. He works as a Japanese translator right around here. I reached out to him to see if he'd be willing to try and make contact with Lobo Gazai, and after a couple of weeks and several messages, he never received an answer. So this is where the story ends, for now. Around this same time, I had actually been working at a convention and someone mentioned Zen Marketplace. And so I loaded up Zen Marketplace to see if I could order through there. Which doesn't really instill me with a lot of confidence. A few months had gone by and at this point I kind of put in the back of my mind thinking I was never going to get anything out of the store until I saw a post that they were opening a physical location. Now you'd have to be insane to buy a $2,000 ticket to Japan just to buy some cell paint. Lucky for this video, I'm not actually insane, just crazy, but I do have friends. This is friend of the channel Dan from Sadabots. He's been on this channel before and he has helped me out a lot. He happened to mention that he was going to Japan and I kindly persuaded him and asked if he'd be willing to visit the store for me. Now Dan was only in Tokyo for a short amount of time, so this was a big ask. And he delivered. It's just unfortunate that it wasn't open. Here he is on the outside of the store. It's locked, and as he said, it looks possibly abandoned. A few days later, they posted this picture on their Instagram. The store was open. I want you to take a look at those timestamps. We missed the opening by days. But Dan is an awesome guy, and the fact that he gave up part of his vacation to go look for these paints, I couldn't be more grateful. Thank you, Dan. But then, another twist. Out of the blue, my cousin who originally translated for me said he would be going to Japan on business. So we're back in business. My cousin travels to Japan. Success. He goes to the store and buys me as much of the paint as he can, but stock was low and the store self-served, so he couldn't really ask any questions because I really wanted to make a large order with larger quantities. But it doesn't matter, he has the paint and he plans on sending them as soon as he gets back home. Unfortunately, when he gets back home, we're dealing with a postal strike and the paints he bought are stuck in a different country. That's just my luck. But then, this is Mike. My buddy Mike has been wanting to go to Japan for a long time as kind of a delayed honeymoon of sorts. So it's only fitting that I would kind of impose upon his honeymoon and ask him to visit a paint shop for me. My logic being is that yes, my cousin had the paint, but with the postal strike, I had no idea when they would show up, and until they're in my hand, they don't exist. So Mike went to Japan and Mike was able to bring back every paint they had in stock. And this time Mike lives close by, so I can finally say, I got the paint. Oddly enough, 1 week later, my other cousin was visiting and he ended up bringing up the paints with him to avoid the postal service. So before we go any further, I want to give a big shout out to all my friends and family. This video would not be possible without you. Thank you for sacrificing your vacation time for the greater good.
It's all about the greater good.
The greater good.
How can this be for the greater good?
The greater good.
Now that you appreciate how hard it was to get these paints, let's get this review going. Paint. Chromacolor versus Loppo Art Supply versus Toon Tones versus Lefranc Flashe. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and rap. I mentioned Lefranc Flashe or Flash. I've heard both pronunciations. It's a vinyl emulsion paint, and I've tried this paint before and it did not go well. But if I'm being fair, that was very early on in my cell painting days, and I've learned a lot since then. And I also want to include a paint that seems to be carried in more location and is in production. I'm also going to include Toon Tones in this because I've been using it the longest. And also, even though it's no longer in production, you can still find bottles in the wild. The point of this comparison video is to see how these perform as cell paints. To do this, we're going to go over setup, the painting process, and the finish. My goal here is not to create something that looks like a cell painting, but rather something you could use to do traditional cell animation. Now for the disclaimer. These are all my personal impressions. I'm not sponsored anyway, I'm not affiliated in any way, and there might be a few things I don't know. I'm just doing what I can to keep cell painting alive. Ever since I started doing little animations, I don't really feel like painting something so similar 4 times. And because these were going to be done with 4 different paints, there's no way they would actually match up in a color sense. So I had to look and work with the color choices I had available. I looked through my colors, and the only color I knew for sure I had in all 4 paint brands other than white and black was red and blue. And the first character that came to my mind was Spider-Man and his one true love, Black Cat. That's right, I said it. Mary Jane was terrible. I mean, comic Mary Jane was fine, but animated version, especially that yellow and purple one, yeah. Also, Jennifer Hale voiced Black Cat in the 90s animated series, and I love Mass Effect, so easy win. I decided to do 4 different Spider-Man styles just to kind of avoid boredom. For Loppo Paint, I will be doing a cell conversion of Black Cat and Spider-Man from the Spectacular Spider-Man series. For Chromacolor, I'll be doing a painting from the 96 animated series.
Oh, déjà vu.
What did you see?
A black cat went past us, and then another that looked just like it.
How much like it? Was it the same cat?
Might have been, I'm not sure.
For Toon Tones, I'm going to be revisiting Marvel Rivals.
Déjà vu. A black cat went past us, and then another that looked just like it.
How much like it? Was it the same cat?
Originally, when I started this video, I didn't plan on including Lefranc, so I decided to scale this one down. So I'm doing a cell conversion of Black Cat in a Spider-Man t-shirt by J. Scott Campbell.
Oh.
All right, let's do this one last time. My name is
Chromacolor, and for the last 10 years, I have been the one and only cell vinyl paint. I'm pretty sure you know the rest. Used in numerous award-winning animated films, I'm extremely pigment rich. I dry matte and smooth and finish flat, ensuring when your paint is dry, the cell remains nice and flat. The matte finish also means you won't get any unwanted reflections when digitizing. I flow beautifully on animation cells to produce wonderful results.
And I did this.
I'm available in 100ml pots, come in 37 colors, and a paint set. And I am the one true cell paint. Fun fact, for years I looked for cells from the 90s Spider-Man series. It took me way longer than I'd like to admit to find out that it was actually colored digitally on the cap system, which is a bit odd considering the next series, Spider-Man Unlimited, was actually cell painted. I've always thought of the 90s Spider-Man series as my Spider-Man series, like that's the one I kind of was introduced to Spider-Man in, so I was really excited to do a painting from it. I chose to do this with Chromacolor because I'm very familiar with the paint, and part of me wants this one to go smoothly so that I can take it to the upcoming Niagara Comic-Con. Over the last year and a half, Chromacolor has become my new standard. It is the paint I instinctively reach for, and that really comes down to the fact that it performs well in almost every category. Good color choice, dries fast, has the best finish, it mixes well, and it's easy to work with.
I'm pretty sure you know the rest. You see, I saved the city, fell in love, I got married, saved the city some more, maybe too much. My marriage got testy, made some dicey money choices, don't invest in a spider-themed restaurant. Then like 15 years passed, blah, 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 super burn, I broke my back, a drone flew into my face, but I handled it like a champion.
But luckily, Chromacolor is still fairly easy to fix your mistakes with, so I was able to remove the paint twice and move on.
My name
is Lopo Gazai cell paint. And for the last 3 years, I thought I was the one true anime paint. I'm pretty sure you know the rest. Originally was a project designed to categorize anime colors, decided to go into cell production. 88 different colors, multiple cell sheets, sizes and thicknesses. Did I mention I do animation supplies? I still found time to ignore Vinyl.paints' messages, opened a shop, offered paint in 200ml or 12ml, and I am the one and only anime paint. I chose to do Spectacular Spider-Man with the Loppo Gazai paint. I chose to do this because I think this is the painting that most resembles an actual animation frame. The line art is straightforward and the lighting is taken right out of the show. I took this test the most serious of the 4 because since it's still in production, I wanted to really test it and thoroughly examine it to see how it compares against my go-to paint, Chromacolor. The Loppo Gazai paint might be the most advanced paint that I use. I'm not saying that it's advanced as in it's better, but as in you need to really understand certain fundamentals of cell painting in order to get it to work properly. As you can see here from the purple, even in the bag, brand new, it's sealed, you get a lot of separation. But so far, I've been able to work everyone back to a working state. This paint dried really fast in about 25 to 30 minutes. I was really curious to see how this paint was going, so I decided to peek on the other side, and that was a big mistake. This paint seems to be a little bit more runny than the other paints, and maybe that's because it seems to be less plasticky or vinyl-y than the other paints. When I lifted it up, all the paint from the flesh tones just ran. I had to do a major cleanup, and I had to pretty much do a second coat of skin tone just to cover up the mistake. One of the things I think is really cool about Loppo is that in one of their blogs, they mentioned that they started out as a color matching project. They were trying to digitize the original paint colors from the animes in the 80s, I think. Their colors are amazing, and what I really like about them is that they do truly feel different than the Western style paints. Like they are on a whole different color spectrum than Toon Tones or Chromacolour. However, I have to admit, I only have a small sample size, so a lot of this is based on color palettes I've seen online. I really wish I could get my hands on more of these paints. Overall, the Loppo Gazai paint was solid and it didn't have any surprises, which is a good thing. One thing I noticed is that it dries fairly close to the wet color. Some of the other paints when it dries will almost look 2 shades lighter than what it did when it was wet. But I actually ran into a bit of a problem with the black cat where I did a gray and a black, and because the gray dried so dark, it didn't really have the contrast that I would have liked it to have. Not a problem with the paint, but just a little bit of a tip if you ever use it. The paint does require you to have some knowledge of cell paint in order to get your mixtures right, but overall, I would say it performed very well and it is definitely a good option. And yes, I did not mix enough red for the Spider-Man, but when you only have 12 milliliters of paint, you tend to be a little bit conservative.
All right, people, let's start at the beginning one last time. My name is
Flashe by Lefranc Flashe, and I sound fancy. I am a modern alternative to traditional acrylic or oil paints. I'm highly flexible and have a fluid texture with intense pigments. I combine matte finish and the opacity of gouache with the indelectability and durability of acrylic on all surfaces, making me the premier alternative to traditional art materials. Originally designed in 1954 for opera sets, I told you I was fancy, my texture is velvety smooth. Extra fine texture is highly concentrated with light resistant pigments. The paint is flexible, fluid, and opaque with a binder made from vinyl resin emulsion that allows for dilution and water-based cleaning. Flashe is available in 76 colors. I come in a 120mm reusable glass jar or 80mm tubes, and I might be the one true cell paint alternative. I didn't think this paint was gonna work. I used Flash once before and it was a bit of a nightmare. This was early on in my cell painting journey and I've learned a lot since then, and a few people have been recommending it, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that this might not work. I go to conventions quite often and I always see this J. Scott Campbell cover and it seems to be quite popular. I don't really know why. Joking aside, I always felt Scott Campbell had a bit of an anime influence on the way he does his characters, and I actually would love to see his style animated. Campbell has also done a lot of Spider-Man covers, and in my head he kind of pops up whenever people talk about Spider-Man, at least in comic form. Another reason why I wanted to do this one is because there's a version of this which is just the pencils, and I wanted to work on my ink and paint. Because the first time I used Flash paint went so terribly, I took some extra precautions this time. The first time I used it, I had cell warpage as well as color separation. Although, to be fair, the first time I used it, I didn't mix the paint, so it was rather thick. This time, in an effort to get a true animation finish, I did mix it down to that whole milk consistency. As a safety precaution, I taped down the cell on multiple sides to avoid warpage. The one disadvantage to taping it down is that you're not able to review your work, so if it's going terribly wrong, you won't know until you've finished it. I think the paints I have that are in the tubes are from the Series 1, and the ones in the jars are Series 2. The thing I noticed is that some of the Series 1 paint had begun to separate. I was able to mix it together, but I noticed it would leave particles in the paint. This wasn't a deal breaker, but just make sure you take the extra time to really get rid of it before you start painting. I found that the Series 1 paint, or the ones that come in the tube, came out more like a paste, as opposed to the Series 2 paint that I got in the glass jars. They seem to be closer to a moisturizer texture, and they were a lot easier to mix. When mixing the paint, I did find that it created air bubbles, the Series 1 more so than the Series 2, but the air bubbles it produced were very manageable. I was a little bit worried on how this paint would react, because it is a lot thicker than any of the other cell vinyl paints. But once I distilled it with water, it became very easy to work with. Superficially, just from an eye test, it didn't feel as pigmented or as opaque as the other cell vinyl paints, but it still seemed to be doing a good job. Because I was using this as a bit of an inking test, I did most of the black in ink. Hindsight, I wish I would have used the paint more for line art, but the parts I did use for line art did work fine. One of the big complaints I have for this was the slow dry time. By far, this was the worst dry time of all the paints. I've seen reviews for this paint where they say it dries in 13 minutes or 15 minutes. but maybe that's on paper. It definitely doesn't dry that fast on cell. I'm kind of doing a faux pas here. Usually when you're doing the paint, you should start with the darker colors and then go to your lighter colors. But with the white here, I originally didn't plan on doing it two tones. But when I saw the color of the ivory paint, I decided it would actually kind of look nice to have the two different tones for the hair. Another note, which is both a negative and a positive, is that it is the hardest paint to fix. If you make a mistake, go over the lines, or you need to remove paint, it's definitely the toughest to remove, which is a positive because it makes me feel like it will be durable. But it's a negative when you flip the painting over and you see maybe you went over the line or you need to make a correction. It's probably the least forgiving. I'm not really surprised, but I could tell that the white was going to need another coat, so I used the second tone or the shadow tone to just do another coat over the rest of the hair. I really thought I had made a mistake when I painted these lips. They seemed a little bit too bright, but the paint did dry a little bit lighter and it ended up looking okay. One of the things I've noticed about the Flashe or Flashe paint is that they do seem to have a bit of a pastel kind of color palette. It's very different than any of the other vinyl paint brands. I've said this over and over and over on this channel. One of the biggest reasons why I hate mixing paint is that if you don't mix enough, you're in for some serious trouble. You probably won't be able to mix something that will match. I noticed as I was going that I was kind of running out. So as you can see here with the shadows, I'm kind of shaping them as I go along rather than doing a line and then just filling in the rest. Not something you ever want to do in animation, but for a one-off painting, it's fine. The paint mixes very well with other Flashe paint, but I'll have to do a separate test to see if it's compatible with other vinyl paints.
My name is
Toon Tones.
I thought I was the one and only.
Vinyl paint.
What a day. I'm pretty sure you know the rest.
I'm discontinued.
And blonde. I was kind of perfect. It was like looking in a mirror.
But I did come in 38 colors, made in California. High quality, smooth flowing, quick drying vinyl acrylic for all artists. I don't crack, chip, flake, and I was the only vinyl paint. I knew this was going to be the most experimental of all the paintings I did for this video. I enjoy the style of Marvel Rivals, but one of the things it really relies on is its gradients into black. You see very bright up top, but by the time you get to the feet, it's almost a pitch black. As you know, you can't do gradients on cell paint. So the first thing I had to do was choose a paint. For this one, I chose Toon Tones. If you want a more adult look, Toon Tones is probably the paint for you. I'm really gonna miss Toon Tones because it's the darkest of the vinyl paints. Think Spawn, Batman, Aeon Flux, Heavy Metal 2000. For me, Toon Tones is, I know this sounds weird, but like a gothic paint. I don't think it's quite as good as Chromacolor in terms of line art, but it's still very easy to control and predict. As I mentioned, the shadowing in Marvel Rivals is not repeatable in cell paint. So for this one, I just decided to have fun with it. I kind of just let the brush go where I thought it should go. I put in as many tones as I want. You probably couldn't animate with this many different tones of colors, but I had fun. In terms of drying time, Toon Tones is the third best. Chromacolour and the Loppo Gazai paint dried way quicker, but this was way better than the Flashe or Flash paint. I usually use Posca paint markers on the top of the cell for metallics, but I tried this time to put them behind the cell and then put a layer of light gray on top to give it a little bit more depth, and it worked quite well. One of Toon Tones' faults is that it is the tackiest of all the paints. No, it doesn't dress poorly, it just sticks to almost everything. It's got a bit of a rubber, sticky feel to it. It does give it some advantages, which means it's probably the easiest one to clean up, or if you need to edit your painting, it's usually peels the easiest. It can stick to the back of paintings and other things, so you got to be very careful with how you place it down. Even after some dry time, it's still easy to fix. I really hated how Spider-Man's face turned out, so the next day I went back and it was so easy to remove it. I wouldn't be able to do this with some of the other paints. And even on Black Cat, you probably noticed that even after I painted in all of her legs, I decided to kind of almost etch in slots for additional colors on the black cat on her legs. And even though the paint had been dried for days, it still worked great. So one of Toon Tones' greatest strengths is that it is probably the easiest one to edit. It is the one that is hardest to kind of present because if you put it on a background for too long or anything, it will stick. It keeps its tackiness for days, so don't ever place it face down or squeeze it between two sheets of paper. I will say though, it does dry to a workable state in about an hour. Even if it's not fully dry, you can at least start to apply your next colors. The one thing that has become a bit of a problem with some of my Toon Tones is that they've separated beyond the point of being able to be fixed. I think separation is one of the drawbacks of a vinyl paint, because I've noticed that every vinyl paint, you'll have one that just separates, and sometimes you can get them back together, sometimes it takes a lot of work, but every once in a while there's a paint that it just never really kind of goes back together. The other thing I noticed, especially when doing this test, because I was really comparing the paints, is that the red usually performs the worst for every paint. There is no red that seems to just be way better than the others. If you want to look for the weakness in a paint, at least when it comes to opacity, red is the easiest way of telling that because it usually performs the worst. One thing I won't miss about Toon Tones are the paint clogs. I am constantly cleaning these paint clogs, and honestly, I feel like I'm wasting more paint to clogs than I'm actually on the actual cell. Speaking of clogs, I don't know if this is a positive or a negative, but without a doubt, Toon Tones is the most plasticky of all the paints. And you can see that from these clogs. They're nice and thick and they're almost little chunks of plastic. Chromacolor also gets plasticky, but nowhere near as defined as the Toon Tones. I ended up using a lot of different shades on Spidey because I wanted him to create this effect of him fading into the shadow. I think it turned out great, but I definitely would say this is way too complicated to actually do an animation this way. Well, that was a lot. And this is definitely going to be my longest video. I'm going to combine my final thoughts and review together just to keep my sanity and to wrap up this video a little bit quicker. To keep things simple, I've broken it down into different categories. The first category is skill level. I'm going to rate each paint between novice and expert. This is a non-quantifiable category. It's just how I feel they perform. This will take into account how easy it is to mix, general ease of use, and how easy is it to make corrections. Skill does not mean that the quality or the ability of the paint is better, but just how much experience you need to use it. Then I'm going to look at dry time, the number of colors available, and how easy is it to get this paint. Hopefully this will help narrow down the right paint for you. I will then go over my recommended use, and after that, the final category, finish. This will look at everything tangible, things I can directly compare, such as line, density, bubbles, opacity, smoothness, and flatness. While I do all of these categories, I will be sprinkling notes, final thoughts, and of course, reveals. Chromacolor. I'm absolutely thrilled how this one turned out. There's a reason why I consider Chromacolor as the go-to cell paint. As someone who looked for Spider-Man cells for years, this hits all the right spots. Sometimes redoing something in that cell form just shows how lacking or upscale technology is. Imagine what it would look like if we could rescan all those 90 TV shows from cells. I did notice some slight discoloration on the black. I'm not sure if that was a mixing issue. It was very minor, but it could also have been caused from all the different attempts at removing the blue. Our first benchmark is how easy is it to use Chromacolor? And I think it's the perfect midpoint. It's not the easiest and you can still end up having problems, but overall, it's fairly usable out of the bottle. It usually hasn't separated out of the bottle and it can be mixed easily. And most importantly, you can fix your mistakes and just look at the finish on the back. I think this paint falls right around here in the middle. You definitely need to have some knowledge to get the most out of it, but it's a paint for beginners and experts alike. Dry time. Chromacolor performs very well in the dry test. It finished drying in about 25 minutes. There's still a spot of dampness in the middle, but most of it is dry to the touch. Remember, dry to the touch does not mean it's fully bonded to the cell. It just means you can work with it. put on the next adjacent color without fear of smudging it or getting paint on your glove. I would still always recommend giving it at least 24 hours to fully dry. Colors. It's not great. It comes in 37 colors, which is on the low end. I really wish they had more choice, but you still have a decent selection of colors. Availability. Chromacolor seems to be well stocked on their online store. I have not seen it sold in any stores, but they do ship internationally, and I've had nothing but great experiences dealing with them. Online they sell for £9.95 British pounds, which translates to 1837 Canadian or $13.55 US. And this is per 100 milliliters. Going forward, I will convert the price per 100 milliliters. This texturing here is on me, not the paint. I accidentally rubbed my glove up against it while I was moving it. Recommended use. Chromacolor is the most versatile paint. I would say it should be your first consideration for animation. I would also say it would do a good job of a one-off cell painting as well. Its colors are vibrant, which lends itself very well to that 90s Warner Brothers Fox Kids style. It has pretty good range in terms of tone. I do wish it had more browns and grays. The biggest limitation of this paint for sure has to be the lack of color choice. Yes, mixing is an option if you're doing a one-off cell painting, but not so much if you're planning on animating. One of the most unforgiving tests is the backlight test. It gives you a good indication of how the paint is performing, but it makes your painting look amateurish. It's just so unforgiving, but I think it's useful because it amplifies all the blemishes and weaknesses of the paint, and sometimes your technique. I want to be clear here that Chromacolor is the most opaque of all the brands, so no brand going forward will do better than this. But as you can see here, especially on the red, the pigment diffusion is nowhere near perfect. The fact that only the red is problematic is a win. With Chromacolor, so many of their colors are just a single coat paint finish. Chromacolor is tied for line art. I can't give it first place because most of the paints performed about the same. I would definitely recommend using ink for the blacks though. Bubbles can be a bit of an issue with Chromacolor. It's not the worst, but it's noticeably worse than Loppo. In opacity, it performs the best overall. As I mentioned, even the reds, which are usually the worst color, do okay. The whites are significantly more opaque than other brands. It also dries very smooth and flat. And this is why I think this is my first choice if you're going to choose one brand for animation. One of the things I loved about 90s Marvel animation is the way that they truly tried to make it look like a comic book. That crescent shadowing on Black Cat's shoulder is just straight out of the book of Jim Lee, and I love it. X Factor. I'm gonna say it. I think Chromacolor is the best overall cell paint, but it's not without its flaws. And just like every other brand, sometimes paints can permanently separate. So don't ignore the warning signs. Look at the blue on this palette. This was a giant red flag that I ignored. Cell paint doesn't usually separate like that. I was so convinced it was user error that I did it again, and I mixed it for twice as long and the same thing happened. It sucks that cell paints separate, and I really hope to find a solution for this. And despite the unexpected problems, I am so happy with how this one turned out, and I'm looking forward to bringing it to Niagara Falls Comic Con. Loppo Gazai paint. I was really worried that this paint wouldn't be worth the effort it took to get the paint, but I'm actually pretty happy with it. I really wish I could find a way to get more paint colors and definitely need larger quantities. First, let's talk about skill level. No sugarcoating it. This might be the hardest paint to use. It doesn't perform quite the same as the other cell paints. You really need to have some cell paint experience to get this to perform. Out of the bottle, it's very paste-like and requires a lot of mixing. And you can absolutely overmix with water, so be careful. Also, I'm not fully sure that this is a vinyl paint. I noticed it had a lot more flow, and that can lead to other problems. It can also be difficult to remove, so large corrections aren't recommended. Dry test. It performed really well in the dry test. I realized I should have timed it in a larger area. I did the side of the mask, and that's not really comparable to the other tests, so I did add a little bit of time. But when watching back the time lapse, I noticed it was an additional 5 minutes for the larger area to dry. In terms of color selection, in store, they had tags for 33 different colors, but online, they say they have 88. I think their color choices online look amazing, but I only have a handful of colors to do this experiment with, so I don't know how comfortable I feel weighing in on this. Availability. Yarp.
Is everything okay? Yarp. Sergeant Angel's been taken care of. Yarp. He's not gonna get back up again. Narp.
I don't really know how to answer this. I guess if you live in Japan, you might be good to go. If you visit the store, they do have some stock. So if anyone lives in Japan and wants to help me get more of these paints, let me know. Cash. Online, you can order 200 milliliter bottles for 5,480 yen. That's $47.52 Canadian. After some quick maths, that's $23.76 Canadian, or $17.46 US dollars per 100 milliliters. I would absolutely recommend this cell paint for animation, and if all those colors on their site are actually available, I would also recommend it for cell painting. When I turn on the backlight, you can clearly see that it doesn't quite perform as well as the Chromacolor. The red and white, even part of the blacks, appears patchy. And in fact, you can see the background peeking through the white part of the hair. Now this can easily be fixed with a second coat or a backing color, but it's not as opaque as Chromacolor. I decided to place it in third place for line art. It really did go on smooth and I really liked it, but I can't ignore how the opacity levels would affect the line art. And unfortunately, I don't have a large enough sample size to feel comfortable saying that it was just as good as the other ones. One area where Loppo excels is that it does create the least amount of bubbles, which was an absolute surprise to me because it came out as a paste and requires more mixing than the other paints. But I'm not complaining, bubbles can really slow down the progress. The opacity did hurt this paint. It's just not a one coat paint, but that's not a deal breaker. With the quick dry time, you can apply a second coat and already move on to the next color before many other paints dry. Where it does excel is that it dries very flat and matte, so this is probably an ideal candidate for animation. It does have a bit of more of a chalky feel to it, where the other ones feel more plasticky and synthetic, but it seems to bind to the cell very well. Oh, I almost forgot to talk about the painting. I think the Black Cat and Spider-Man turned out great. If you can get this cell paint easily, it is a fine cell paint and I would recommend it. Toon Tones. I knew this one was not really going to look like its source material, but it was a hell of a fun time to paint. I really do like experimenting. Does it look like Marvel Rivals game? Not really, but I think it turned out great. Placing our capybara, Toon Tones is probably the easiest paint to use. It's almost like a dense acrylic paint, but very plasticky. It does need a bit of water, but it's fairly forgiving with the mixing process. It's also the easiest one to make corrections with. So in terms of skill level, it's very forgiving. So I'm going to place the capybara in the beginner category. Dry time is not so friendly. It's workable or dry to the touch after about an hour, but it remains tacky for days. So in reality, that kind of is additional dry time. If you were to put it on a background or a folder, it will stick to it, and when you try to peel it off, it can peel off some of the paint as well. So it does require a lot of drying space as well. Colors and availability. Let's be honest, this is a dead product. I only included it because I have it and it was sold in stores, so you might come across it in certain specialized art stores. This paint is probably best suited for one-off cell paintings, or to mix with another cell paint to create additional colors. It has so many dark and rich tones that I use this for that quite frequently. If you're willing to wait long enough, it has a decent finish. It's more textured than Chroma and Loppo, but you gotta be careful because the paint can really build up, and this is one of the few paints where you can easily over apply. If you combine all of this with the long dry time, it's just not suitable for animation. In a pinch, you could, but it would be my third or fourth choice. Turning on the backlight, we can see that this is probably the second most opaque paint. It struggles on the red like most paints do, but this one seems to have an almost hydrophobic quality to it. It almost kind of leaves a space between where the two paints meet up. Most of these gaps will not be visible with the light off, but I think it's important to understand how the paint performs. I also made sure to paint this one dark to light, so that makes me feel that it's a paint characteristic rather than an application issue. I really liked how this painting turned out. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to hit those darker tones on Spider-Man where the shadow comes in, but it turned out smashingly. I'm glad that I'm well stocked in this paint because, like I said, these darker tones are amazing. If you do come across this in a store, I would urge you to stay away from the olive green color. It seems to have permanently separated beyond repair, and I've bought 2 of them. Flash or Flashe by Lefranc. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. This video's been taking forever and I needed a little bit of levity. I didn't have high expectations for this paint going in. The first time I used it, it was an absolute gong show. So I ended up being peachy pleased with how this one turned out. And that wasn't sarcasm. This surpassed all my expectations. Despite that, I still think this is one of the harder paints to use. And that's mainly due to inconsistency in the paints. The 2 paints were very difficult to work with. And in the case of the yellow, I couldn't get rid of the particles. The jar versions of the paint were night and day different, and they were relatively easy to use. But you don't really know what you're getting into, and that's why I think it's a difficult paint. My limited understanding of this paint is that Series 2 are all jar based and that Series 1 come in larger tubes, but I need to confirm that. Going past the superficial, where this paint really showed its weakness was in dry time. It was just downright painful. Over 2 hours. It was double the dry time of the nearest competitor. I had about 7 colors on this painting. That's 14 hours of dry time, minimum. That's not including secondary tones. That is just way too much for an animation paint. Colors and availability. I think that the colors are unique for this one. The colors that I bought were almost pastel-like. They were softer. And I think if you like pastel, softer colors, you're really gonna love this paint. I think it has a unique look that's different than any of the other cell paints I've reviewed in this video. Mind you, I do only have a small sample size and they offer a lot of colors. It says that it's available in 76 colors, but you can't buy directly from Lefranc in North America. Luckily, it does seem to be carried in most art stores, but selection will vary. The 2 art stores I go to seem to stock about 33 different colors. Price. It looks like this is offered in 3 different series and they're priced between $22 and $28 per 125 milliliters. If we take the medium, let's call it 25, we do some math. That means it costs about $20 per 100 milliliters. I would absolutely recommend this paint for one-off cell painters. It does finish very smooth and flat, so it's tempting to say animation as well, but you'd have to be mad to deal with those dry times. Before I turn on the backlight, I want to point out that it suffers from the same thing that the Toon Tones does, except for this one is noticeable without the backlight. When we turn on the backlight, it shows that it performed well, but it's also a bit misleading. It has one of the best pigment diffusions of all the paint. In fact, I would go as far to say the best. The red looks fantastic, not as patchy as the other paints, but this is a bit misleading because it was actually the least opaque of all the colors. You can easily see all the inks from the other side of the cell. In regards to bubbles, it performed about the same as all the other paints, but this one had the added bonus of particle issues. I'm really impressed with the finish of this paint. It really does dry flat, matte, and smooth. It would just be great if it dried quicker. I did notice that when I did do a second coat on the hair, I did get some texturing, but the finish was still really smooth, and I imagine you wouldn't probably be able to notice major texturing until a 3rd or 4th coat. The X Factor. I think the big X factor for this one, because it's so readily available and it comes in so many different colors, is how does it perform with other vinyl paints? So I decided to mix it with Chromacolor and do 3 tests. The first test in purple is just how I would mix it normally. Once again, I'm aiming for that cell paint consistency here. and that's the first one I did with purple. I added a little bit more water. This is closer to how I would use it if I was doing line art or inking, and for the final test I used the tube paint to see how that would perform. As I mentioned before, it's not the easiest paint to edit or remove from the cell. I noticed that the tube paint once again had particles which dried as bumps. Unfortunately, the particles actually affect the painting on the other side, looking like dots and fibers. So at this point, I feel safe to recommend Lefranc in a jar. Hopefully they all have the same moisturizer consistency as a color mixture option. Just remember to keep the primary color of vinyl paint to help you with the dry time. If we flip the backlight on, we can see that the original mixture of Chromacolor and Lefranc actually holds up really well. Even the one with slightly more water is still performing. The line art, not so much, but I would stay away from the tubes. I'm very glad that I was convinced to give Lefranc another chance. The painting turned out great, and I have another tool in the chest. Alright, I'm done. Once again, I hope this video was helpful. It was a lot of information, but thank you for sticking to the end. This was a long process, but I hope it was useful. I did have a blast painting Felicia and Spider-Man, but I'm looking forward to painting something a little different. If you have any questions, I do respond to comments and emails. You can also find me on Instagram. Once again, thanks for watching. Please share, like, and subscribe. I'm Brian, and this was a very exhausting Vinyl Paints.